Sony announced the new a6300, the replacement for the Sony a6000, one of the best-selling interchangeable lens cameras of all time. It has some really exciting new features. Let's go over them quickly. Sony invited us out to join them in New York City for the press release. We got time to actually play with the camera. They did not allow anybody they allowed us to shoot with it, but we couldn't actually take sample pictures and take them with us. So we do have some experience with the camera. Unfortunately, can't show you comparison shots, but we'll be doing that soon, so be sure to subscribe to see those coming up. Among the most exciting new features are 4K video. That's huge. And the full APS-C sensor is used for the 4K video, which is kind of a really big deal because Nikon announced the D500 with 4K video, but that's cropped. The Nikon D5 also cropped when it shoots 4K video. So the fact that it's uncropped and it's not skipping pixels, it's using the entire sensor, means you should get images that are as clean as those from the Sony a7R II, which costs like $3,000 for $1,000. And that's pretty amazing. We're pretty excited about the 4K video quality that we'll be able to get from this tiny little $1,000 camera. The sensor is 24 megapixels, which is similar to the previous sensor, but Sony says it should have better image quality. Of course, we'll have to wait to actually validate that. It shoots either 8 or 11 continuous frames a second, and I'll explain the difference. At 8 continuous frames a second, you'll get a much better experience, especially for things like following moving subjects in sports, because in between each frame, the camera will actually show you a view of what is happening in real time. It has a very fast refresh rate for a mirrorless camera. At 11 frames a second, it won't do that. And what happened with the Sony a6000, the previous generation, it shot at 11 frames a second. But every time you shot at 11 frames a second, you would see the previous picture you took. So you were always looking at something at a tiny bit of a delay. And that makes it almost impossible to track a moving subject because you just can't keep up with something that's moving. So the 8 frames a second is going to be far more usable, and in our testing it did look way, way better than trying to shoot in the 11 frames a second, and we're excited at the implications for sports. But of course, the a6000 was a letdown for sports photographers in many different ways. We're hoping the a6300 will beat it, and we'll test it pretty soon. They also bragged about having more focusing points and improved phase detection focusing system. We tested out. It did seem very snappy, but again, that's the kind of thing that you need to test in multiple different conditions, kind of real-world conditions. And they had set up sort of short-range studio conditions with only a fairly wide-angle lens that we could shoot with the a6300, and it worked great with that. But the real test is going to be real-world conditions with a telephoto lens, so we'll let you know. For those video shooters, this model includes a mic jack. It's a big deal because before, if you wanted to run your own mic into the camera, you had to put in this ridiculous hot shoe adapter, and which included a microphone, and it was expensive and clumsy. So it finally has a real mic jack that's a necessity for any sort of real video camera. Unfortunately, there were lots of kind of bummers, at least things that bummed me out about this new camera. The controls are virtually identical. They added one little flippy switch that's on the a7R II, which we don't really use that much. But otherwise, the controls and the battery are identical, and that was always our single biggest problem with the Alpha 6000 and the entire Sony series. The secondary dial, the exposure compensation dial, it's kind of weak and flimsy, and it gets hit accidentally all the time. It also doubles as the directional control, so sometimes when you go to select something different, you'll accidentally turn it and change your ISO or your exposure compensation or whatever you have it set to. There's not a dedicated control for changing the focusing point, so to change the focusing point, you have to go in and select something or hit a shortcut key and then change it, and it's just really like 1 or 2 extra button presses. But when you're shooting sports or wildlife, changing between a focusing point on the left and a focusing point on the right is extremely common because the person you're shooting is going to be zigging and zagging, and you need to always shoot around them. The sort of best approach in the mirrorless systems is to select all the autofocus points and let the camera decide. But in my testing on the last couple of days when I was using the a6300, it frequently made the wrong choice. And that was the same problem we had with the other mirrorless cameras. When you let them use all the focusing points, well, they might focus on the defender who's facing away from you rather than the person on offense who's facing towards you. And that makes it very difficult and kind of imprecise to use for sports. Sony, we really need to be able to control precisely which focusing point we're using, and we need to be able to switch focusing points without going into a special mode first. Another disappointment, which isn't something that other cameras of this class have, but there's no IBIS, steady shot inside, which is stabilizing the sensor. With this feature, which is a feature of the A7R2, the A7 II, and the A7S II, as well as some other cameras like the Olympus cameras and the Panasonic cameras, you can attach any lens, even lenses without image stabilization, and they will be stabilized. And this makes hand-holding so much better. It means you can use fast primes in dim environment and hold them for, a quarter of a second. And that can let you get handheld shots in just at night. It's a terribly useful feature, especially for videographers. And it's missing from this camera, but at a $1,000 price point, you might not have expected that. Anyway, it just would have been a nice to have. One thing that is a big deal, especially given the focus on shooting video with this camera, is the lack of a touchscreen. You really need a touchscreen when you're shooting video because it allows you to easily switch between focusing points. And again, it's a real challenge, especially without a dedicated focus control dial. So we hope to see that in a future version. And that lack of a touchscreen is going to mean we're going to push some people to other cameras when they're serious about video. This camera comes in at $1,000, and you can pre-order it at sdp.io/a6300, or at least you should be able to very soon. Using our link means we get a few pennies out of every dollar, and we appreciate the support. Here's a side-by-side shot I took at the Sony event showing the Alpha 6000 on the left and the Alpha 6300 on the right. You can see they're basically identical except for that one flippy switch, same size and same profile. Let's quickly go over the differences point by point between the old camera and the new camera. The old camera, the Alpha 6000, is $500 new right now, body only, no lens. The new camera will be a full $1,000, so it's twice as expensive. But the A6000, you can pick it up used for $375, and that's a fantastic deal. It's an amazing camera for $375, and that means we've recommended it to an awful lot of people because the bang for the buck there is fantastic, and it's going to continue to be fantastic even after the Alpha 6300 is out. I think we're going to end up recommending the A6000 to a lot of new camera buyers. So, of the key advantages, one of the biggest ones is video here. 2160p, which is 4K video at 30 frames a second. The A6000 simply doesn't have that resolution. The A6000 does have full HD at 1080p and 60 frames a second, which provides very smooth kind of movement and allows you to slow down to slow motion at 2x. The A6300 will allow you to do slow motion at 4x because it goes all the way up to 120 frames a second. Another video-centric feature is S-Log3, which captures greater dynamic range. Basically, you'll be able to see the detail in the clouds in the very bright sky, as well as getting good detail in the shadowy face of your subject. It's something only really serious videographers will use, and even as serious videographers, we don't use it all the time, just when the conditions call for it. But nonetheless, it is a feature that we like to have, and that's kind of like a need to have when you're shooting video. And as I mentioned earlier, it has an internal mic jack. That's a real big deal. Another key difference is the addition of the slower 8 frames a second, but you get that continuous video feed of what's going on in the outside world, so you can actually keep up with moving subjects when shooting sports. The electronic viewfinder has many, many more pixels, so the A6000 was actually a step down from its predecessor. This new version goes back to a higher resolution EVF, which looks fantastic. It looks just great. It actually looks a little bit better than the real world because it can kind of brighten things up in a dim environment. Let's compare it to another great video camera in a similar price range, the Panasonic GH4. And the Panasonic GH4 continues to be our favorite recommendation for, say, people who have the budget and they're going to be shooting maybe YouTube videos. It's a very different camera in many ways. It comes in a little more expensive new at $1,300 without a lens. But you can pick it up used for about $900 because it's about a full year old now, maybe actually almost 2 years old. Came out in 2014, May of 2014. And we used it as our main video camera for a long time. So let's see precisely how they compare. You can see based on this camera size comparison from camerasize.com, which seems to be my new favorite website, the Alpha 6300 is significantly smaller than the GH4, and that's a big plus. But if you use the GH4, it feels just great in the hands. It fills out your hand really well, and all the buttons and dials fall in precisely the right place. I really prefer to use the GH4 despite its bigger size and despite my preference for smaller cameras, just because of the way the buttons and dials are built. Looking at the comparison of the two cameras, they both shoot 4K at the same frames a second. The A6300 will actually do a little bit faster at HD, going up to 120 frames a second. So if you actually want to do slow motion, it would be a better choice for you. They both have their sort of high dynamic range modes, and we'll have to wait to actually get it in to do the testing on how those two compare. The GH4 has usability features that the a6300 simply lacks, and those are a big deal. They're just a really big deal if you shoot videos. It is a touchscreen, so you can focus by touching the screen, and that really helps. It also means you can kind of scrub through your video really easily as you're reviewing it to make sure you got the shot by using the touchscreen. It's a pain on the Sony Alpha series cameras. It also has an articulating screen. The a6300 has a tilt screen, which goes like flips up and down, and that's good for holding the camera over your head or down low to the ground, getting those kind of interesting angles that you need for stills or video. The GH4 has a screen that flips out from the side, so you can tilt it up and down, but you can also turn it around to face the front of the camera, and that's great for selfies if you're holding the camera out like that. For people who are shooting, say, YouTube videos, you can put the camera on a tripod, flip the screen around, and monitor yourself while recording. To do that with an a6300, you'd have to get an external monitor and get batteries for that and hook it up and wire it up. Anyway, the ability to flip that screen around, we find it just genuinely very useful on a video camera, and unfortunately, the a6300 still lacks that. As I mentioned, I like the controls on the GH4 better, and the GH4 is a micro 4/3 mount, which means it can take advantage of all those like hundreds of micro 4/3 native lenses. It just has vastly more lenses than the Sony has for the native E mount, especially in APS-C. However, because the a6300 is using the entire 1.5x APS-C sensor, it's actually about twice as big when you're recording 4K video, because the GH4, with its 2x crop for stills, it actually crops it down further for 4K video to a 2.2x crop. So that means the a6300 is gathering about twice as mumuch light at a given f-stop at a given ISO, meaning your images will have about half the noise. This is actually not that big of a deal for video. These cameras that we're recording with now actually have smaller sensors than even the GH4, and that's okay, because with video we use fairly low resolution and they apply some noise reduction in the processing, so might not ever be a problem for you. But the bigger sensor is definitely better if you're shooting low light videography, something to keep in mind. This is a complete list of all the Sony E-mount APS-C zooms that I could find, and it's 6 lenses. And there might be some more that I couldn't find. I just went to B&H and looked around, but the point I want to make is the Sony E-mount is a fairly new mount, and it takes like decades to build up a good collection of lenses, and there just aren't that many options right now. These are only the zooms. I'm not counting primes. I'm kind of assuming that at a consumer level $1,000 camera, most users will prefer zooms. Sony has an awesome selection of primes, and I'm not even going to try to list them, any of those. If you're a prime shooter, you're probably going to be totally happy with the lenses. If you're a zoom shooter, I just want you to think about this as you're considering your lens, your camera choice, because you need to look at the list and make sure you're going to be happy with these lenses. One thing to note is that there are 2 f4 zooms, but there's nothing any faster than f4. There are no f2.8 zooms. You cannot natively mount the amazing Sigma 18-35 f1.8. You would need some sort of additional adapter. And yes, you can adapt things. But once you do that, the autofocus capabilities drop significantly. You might still be able to autofocus, but it's not nearly as good as it is with these native mount lenses. And a lot of people will choose to use full frame lenses on the a6300 because Sony actually has far more full frame lenses. But I'll give you a link to a full video that explains this in just a second. But I want you to keep in mind that an APS-C camera like this uses only 44% of the image circle of a full frame lens. So you're taking advantage of a very small part of the image circle from a lens, full frame lens. And that means every flaw in the lens is magnified 225%. What it means is when you put a full frame lens on an APS-C body, you get significantly less sharp images. And this isn't like a theoretical thing. I get several messages from people every week who say, why are my pictures so unsharp? I bought this amazing professional grade full frame lens and I'm putting it on my APS-C body, whether it's Canon or Nikon or Sony or whatever. It happens all the time, which is why I wanted to mention it. That's what's going to happen. You can use sharp full frame glass on an APS-C body and get unsharp results. It's just something to keep in mind. If you want more information about it, go to sdp.io/ffcrop. I have a video there that explains it further. So Sony has about 6 native APS-C E-mount lenses compared to ballpark 30 for Canon or Micro Four Thirds, and I didn't check Nikon. And These are rough numbers. I didn't try to itemize every lens, but you do have more variety from some of the other systems. Just make sure that Sony has all the lenses you will need natively before you invest in the system. I also want to say, as I'm saying, that sharpness isn't that big of a deal. It's truly not everything. Things like lighting and exposure and mood and storytelling are all far more important. In fact, I wrote a whole book on it, Studying Digital Photography. You can check it out. So some people make it a big deal, and so I wanted to discuss it. We will have full tests of the a6300 coming soon. Just as soon as Sony can finalize that camera and get it in our hands, we'll have something published. So please subscribe to see those details. Thanks.